really a bit of background about this session. It's a kind of joint HDR supervision community of practice activity, and we're very, very pleased to have it as part of the Teaching and Learning Week program, so that we can also talk about our HDR students in that week. I do, just before I launch into this more formally, want to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And I hope that we all appreciate that this was and always will be Indigenous land, and we're very privileged to be here to be able to meet together on this land to discuss topics this week related to teaching and learning. So we came up with this topic around the art of personalised supervision a little bit earlier this year. So the community of practice has been going for a year. In fact, it was a year almost exactly to the date that we launched the community of practice. It was launched by the acting Deputy Dean, Professor Kim Wilkins, who some of you will know. And it was launched with a session on Halloween called Spooky HDR Supervision Stories, which I believe was quite entertaining. I wasn't there because I was on long service leave. And subsequent to that, we've run a number of activities this year, but the first thing we did is we ran a brainstorming session with our community to try and understand which topics were a priority for you, and which topics you wanted us to develop into workshops or into sessions for the community of practice. And this came up, this kind of rather broad, nebulous topic around how you tailor your supervision approach to different candidates. So the presentation we put together today is very much around that. There is 2 hours in the teaching and learning program for this session. I'm hoping it doesn't go for 2 hours, but we haven't run the session before, so we'll have to play it a bit by ear. But I'm hoping we can finish a little bit earlier. But that's just a little bit of background about how we landed on this topic. And so the objectives are to look at some strategies to give you some tools and some ways that you might think about how you can tailor your supervision practice, to get you just to reflect on and think about diversity and diverse student needs. I think when I say it out loud, it should be fairly obvious that not all of our HDR students are the same. But it's sometimes something that I think you overlook in the busyness of being a supervisor. It can be hard to remember that all students are not the same, and the tools and techniques and strategies that might have worked for our previous student might not work for our current students. So I want to talk a bit about that. And then I also want to finish up just by talking a bit about some of the tools that the university, either through the graduate school or through other parts of the university, provides to support supervisors. Now, it has been set up as a webinar. Karen is very busy moving participants over. Did you want to say something, Karen?
Yeah, thanks, Pierre. Yeah, so because we want you to be able to kind of have a nice interaction online. So in a minute, I'm just going to ask you if you want to join as a panelist, and just accept that. So don't decline, accept, and then you can come across, and then you'll be able to work in the chat. It'll just be like a normal Zoom meeting rather than this Q&A bit at the bottom. That makes sense to everybody? And I'm just starting now. So Kyoto, Marcus, and Motion, I'm bumping you all to the exalted place of panelist. Yep, thank you.
There's
I think we're good now.
I see Marcus coming in. Then we had some of the other people that joined earlier already in here. So just a bit of a workaround. The format wasn't quite right for what we needed. And I had planned to do some breakout rooms as well, but we can't do that in this format. When we get to that part, we'll run that a little bit differently. But I think given that we don't seem to be getting as many people as we were expecting in terms of the number of registrations, that might not be a bad thing. We might have a nice small group that we can discuss some cases with when we get to that part of the session. So if you do have questions, and there are some interactive parts to the session, it's not just me talking for 2 hours, and hopefully it will be quicker than 2 hours. I will ask for your input and your feedback at various times. the best way to do that is through the chat, and that's why we'll move anybody that comes in late over to being a panelist as well, so that you can participate fully in the chat. So this presentation really has 4 parts: the welcome introduction, which I've pretty much done now, understanding diverse HDR needs. We'll talk a little bit about diversity and needs. I'm going to ask you some questions about your own students when we have that conversation. We'll have a look at a couple of case studies, and then we'll talk about some tools and do a wrap up. So the first question I've got for you, and these purple slides, when they come up with the speech bubbles on them, are a kind of a visual cue for you, just to prod you into action. This is I've got a couple of these slides in the presentation where I want your feedback, and as I said, the chat is probably the best way to do that. And the question that I've got for you first up is, I want you to reflect on how your HDR students differ. And some of you may not have had HDR students before. Some of you might only just be starting out and haven't had a lot of students, so this might be hard to answer. And some of you will have a lot of experience and may be able to answer this easily. But have a go, and if you haven't had any students, how do you think HDR students might differ? We've all been, by virtue of being academics, we've all been HDR students, and so you might already have an inkling about how people differ. So Marcus says cultural backgrounds. Any other answers there in the chat? Yeah, okay, good. I can see lots of answers pouring in now. All excellent answers, right? It's about cultural background. We'll touch on that a little bit today. Just for your context, I'm actually presenting this session today. Even though I am the Deputy Dean of the Graduate School, I'm not really presenting it from that perspective. I am going to draw a lot on my own supervision experience. I've supervised over 10 students to completion. I've got 3 of my own students at the moment. So I'm going to draw a lot of my own experience, but culture, Marcus, is certainly a very important factor when you're supervising students. Some students from some cultures expect a very formal kind of relationship and come from cultures where there is a very big power distance between the supervisor and the student, and that affects how they interact with you. Other students come from very laid back, relaxed cultures where the power distance might be smaller. In Australia, is very much at that end of the spectrum. Our culture in Australia tends to be very egalitarian, so power distance is often much smaller, and the students are much more relaxed in their interactions. And that affects a whole range of things, including how much they share with you outside of the professional relationship and the PhD work that they might be doing. Mosen says different education systems. Yes, absolutely. Often that is intertwined with culture, but we need to remember that some of our students come from very structured education systems where the primary learning model is didactic and instructional, and often relies on rote learning. So you learn through rote learning, whereas other students come from systems that might be more like the Australian system, where students are constantly asked to critique and where independent thought is encouraged. That impacts on how you supervise students. Will is on there. Will, I should just have a quick shout out to Will, because Will is working here in the graduate school with us at the moment, and does a lot of the work around our career development framework for our students. So Will's mentioned neurodiversity, and absolutely important point there, and that's one that we'll come back to. Language, yes, I think pretty obvious how language can either facilitate or be a barrier for students in that process of completing their PhD. Their work is, I think, Pradeepa, that's a good point. Some of our students are working while they're doing their PhD. Age and gender is another one. Mason's got another comment there. As you scan through there, different religious backgrounds from Russell. Yeah, absolutely. Will, you've also said different goals after they finish the PhD, and I want to come back to that point too. That is also a very important point. We know from Australian Bureau of Statistics data that 42% of our, not our PhD students, 42% of PhD students across the country, but our percentage is not that different at UQ. 42% end up going into academia, and that might surprise some of you. So more than half of the students that we're currently training as PhD students will not become academics. And that's a point I just wanted to leave you with to think about, because that does mean that some of our students are going to end up somewhere else and may have some different employment goals. Zoe, that's an excellent point as well about having dependents. Increasingly, we're seeing PhD students come back into the university after they've started a family, or sometimes during they have a family during the PhD. And with generations being they are in Australia, if they don't have kids to look after, often they've got elderly parents to look after, and they have caring responsibilities there as well. So those things all can affect our HDR students, and they mean that our students have got different needs, right? So I think I picked up on most of the points in the chat there. So cultural and linguistic diversity, absolutely. A few people have mentioned that. Academic backgrounds, a few people have mentioned. Personal circumstances, we've touched on. Learning preferences, not so much. And although we have touched on neurodiversity as a topic, and career goals have been mentioned. So you've done very well in that chat and picking up on most of the points that I anticipated you would pick up on, and I won't spend too much time on that slide because we've already discussed some of those things. So the next question I've got for you then is, what strategies do you use in your supervision practice to cater for these diverse student needs? And it's okay to say, I don't know, Pierre, that's why I'm here in this session today, to find out. But maybe you've got some solutions that we can build on. So we have got some experienced people in the group today. If you've got any strategies that you use, any tips, any techniques, I'd be keen to hear from you before we actually look at some ideas. I'll give you a minute just to reflect on that, and if you've got some thoughts, pop them in the chat. Or if you feel comfortable talking, I'm more than happy to see people and to hear from you as well if you're willing to come off the mute.
Not as a supervisor, but as the HDR student being supervised. My supervisors do a really great job of allowing for flexibility in my full-time work schedule by being able to switch between in-person meetings and online, and finding times around my schedule, which I really appreciate.
Thanks, Will. So yeah, so there are different modes, and just adapting to what some of your needs are around full-time work.
Pierre, it's Russell here. I think
Yeah.
I've got an interesting case at the moment. That's why I made the religious comment after Marcus's cultural comment. But I've got a female candidate from Oman who is Muslim, and we have developed a very good working relationship. But I know the fact that her meeting with me one-on-one causes her husband a degree of stress. And so being sensitive to that, like yesterday we met in an open space. He was 40 or 50 meters away so he could see us. I find that some way a little bit peculiar, but also a little bit interesting. And so I'm trying to be agile enough to be sensitive to that need. But I got to admit, I find it a little bit peculiar, but I'm adjusting to it.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. That's a good comment. I think those situations can be very challenging for us as Australians, because the way we view gender roles also is very different. But that's a really interesting contribution. some of the ways that we might structure things to help in those situations, and some of the things we've done in the past is also to compose supervision teams in such a way that there's a female member on the supervision team in those kinds of situations. That's an interesting experience. Just reading some of the other comments here, asking students what works best for them. Do they have a preference for supervision styles or approaches? Yeah, a couple of people have said that. Judith's saying a case-by-case basis, but always start a conversation early and set up a process for cycling back. So that's a good point, Judith. When I come back at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the importance of setting expectations, which is actually what the last community of practice was about. So I don't want to spend a whole session talking about expectations, but we will touch on that very briefly. And Mosen said a similar thing, having some initial discussions about what the differences are, what expectations are, getting feedback from students, having individual meetings with each student, even if they work in the same project. So Marcus, that's a good point. Again, there's a big difference, and my background is I'm from the business school, the same as Russell, and so typically in that school, as with most of the schools in the business faculty and also in the humanities and social science faculties, we tend to supervise our students more one-on-one. But of course, some of you are working in the STEM areas where you supervise students who are working in larger groups in labs, and that raises an important point, that in that kind of setting where people are often together and there's more group interaction, instruction going on, you do want to allow space and time to have those one-on-one meetings with students, just to check in occasionally that they are feeling comfortable and that their needs are being met. Okay, well, hopefully we can build a little bit on those strategies. Now, this is a famous model from business. It's called the Hershey and Blanchard situational leadership model, but it's actually a really nice. It's an easy model to apply to supervision of HDR students as well. And this model is really set on two dimensions. One dimension is around how directive you are in your behaviour as a supervisor. From a low directive behaviour to high directive behaviour, so that is directing what the student is doing, and the other dimension is supportive behaviours, from low support to a high level of support. And the thing I like about this model is that then overlays those ideas with the developmental needs or levels of the person that you're supervising, in this case, the student. So in that bottom quadrant where you see S1, you've got a situation where the learner might be described as an enthusiastic beginner. All right, so their competence is usually low, but they're just starting out, so they're highly committed. And in my experience, that's often the case with a new student when they start. They're very excited. They've got into a PhD program. Usually they've been awarded a scholarship as well. And in a lot of cases, they've been a big fish in a small pond, and now suddenly they've come into this big pond and they're the little fish in the big pond, right? But they're keen as mustard and they're very keen to get going with their project. And as the months progress, they start to realize that maybe they didn't know as much as they knew. So enthusiastic beginner. And in that kind of context, under this model, often a more directive style can be useful at the start. Then as that learner starts to gain some competence and some confidence, this is where they become a little bit disillusioned. This is where you get a little bit scared as a student, because you realize that there's all this stuff that you don't know. And that can be a real knock to your confidence and actually lower your commitment levels as well. So sometimes as a supervisor, you have to change your style from being more directive to be more of a coaching role. As the student gains in competence and moves through a PhD, you then shift from more of a coaching mode to a supporting mode, where you're dropping back on the directive behaviour and you're still maintaining a high level of support. And then ideally, as the student gets close to the end of their candidature, they are highly competent, they are highly committed, and you're taking on more of a delegating role. And so I find this model useful, if only to highlight that what might have worked for a candidate at the start of their candidature is unlikely to work for them at the end. That their needs, the needs of candidates change throughout the PhD journey. So it's not just differences between candidates and students that we're talking about. It's also how those needs shift over time as the candidate builds confidence and competence. So there's a couple of things that come out of that model. One is the importance of tailoring your style, and to be able to do that, you do need to keep your finger on the pulse, and that does mean regularly assessing and adapting your supervision style to meet the needs of the student. All sorts of other things that might be going on in the student's personal life as well. That can mean the type of support that they need at that point in time is different to what they might have required a month previously, or what they might need 6 months from now. We touched briefly on cultural competence and cultural differences as well. The cultural sensitivity is important, and it is important to acknowledge and respect different cultural norms and values, and also the differences in communication styles that those cultural norms and values can produce in the way that candidates interact with us. So Russell, your example is a really nice one. It's something that I think a lot of Australians would find challenging and grapple with, but we do need to meet our students halfway, and there is a need to be sensitive to those cultural differences. Flexible communication. So I'll come back to this point in a minute, but offering multiple channels for students to engage with you. I think, Will, you kind of touched on this as a student that also has work commitments, the flexibility of being able to meet with your supervisors, sometimes in person, sometimes online, and sometimes to be able to get stuff done by email is something that's valued. Ensuring regular check-ins, whether they're online or face-to-face, is really important, particularly early on in candidature, where students often need a little bit more structure to get them going. And then empathy and accessibility, so being understanding of students' personal academic challenges and providing flexibility where possible, and those are often caring for children or having other caring responsibilities for parents or other personal challenges that students are facing. So I am going to give you some tools and models in a moment to just unpack this a little bit further. So as we get into the session, we're going to try and go a little bit deeper. But I thought at this point it might help to, particularly for those of you that haven't got much supervision experience, to give you a couple of mini case studies, a couple of scenarios that we can explore together. Now, this is where we were going to do the breakout rooms, but we're not going to be able to do that. And because we've got a fairly small group today, I think what we might do is just work through each of these and have a quick chat about how you might approach them. So let's have a look at May first of all. And now, if you've got lots of supervision experience, I'd be surprised if you haven't had a May at some point as a supervisor. So May is your classic kind of top academic performer, very strong academically, has a strong CV, good GPAs from good universities, and she's earned lots of awards and scholarships. She comes into a PhD program with very high expectations of herself. She has a strong desire to produce groundbreaking research. She wants to change the world, right? But she's also very self-critical. She overanalyzes her own work. And because she does that, she often will hold back submitting drafts for comment. She will hold back discussing her ideas with you because she feels that they're not perfect and they're not good enough for you to see as a supervisor. And this is leading to delays in submitting drafts, which then delays the whole process of providing feedback. Because she's a perfectionist, she's also struggling with work-life balance. You've kind of noticed in interacting with her that she seems to be spending way more time on her PhD than what might be healthy. So I wonder how you might respond to a student like May if you've had a student like her, or if you suddenly find May sitting in front of you and you notice that this is a problem. So we're going to have to use the chat, or welcome to switch on your mic as well. I'd be very keen to hear from you if you find it easier to talk about what you think you might do in this situation. Have we got everybody in the room now, Karen?
Yes, yeah, everybody should be able to. Catherine's still as an attendee, but she chose not to jump in. But everybody should be able to, they can either chat, but they can certainly unmute.
Okay.
So somebody just needs to be brave.
Who wants to go first?
You could cold call someone.
I mean, the obvious thing is to sit down with her and chat to her about it, right? So mention that it's a problem, indicate how it's delaying progress, and try and convince her that her work is good enough to submit drafts for.
Yeah, so Thomas, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here. Often students like May will come back and say, yeah, but I don't think my work's good enough and I don't want to waste your time.
Would
Yeah,
it be worth finding her a peer? Yeah,
I guess
like
so.
yeah, to work with. Maybe someone, maybe a critical friend rather than a, well, not even actually take critical out of that and just talk of like maybe just a peer that she can kind of bounce ideas off and kind of get a sense of progress rather than obviously taking it to the professor level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that has the potential to be particularly effective early on in candidature if you could buddy her up with a second or third year PhD student who's kind of been through the process, can see the benefit of regular feedback cycles with supervisors, to reassure her that her work doesn't have to be perfect. Often, the thing that drives this kind of behaviour is that students like May are afraid of criticism, and so they're afraid of putting their work in front of us as supervisors. Mohsen?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that actually we developed in our center and it seems that it works good is we kind of created a bit of an internal forum. We call it researcher forum that actually kind of like is an informal environment that the students, they can actually present their work, even if it's not complete or if it's only at an idea level. And because like the perfection, the students attend those sessions, not being brave enough initially to present, but when they see how friendly is that environment, actually kind of encourages them essentially to share the work that they think is not perfect. But then the feedback that they get from even other researchers and people in that safe environment, then actually makes them believe that actually, okay, my work is good enough. And I thought that actually maybe that's a good strategy because, yeah, you can tell them actually your work is perfect. You shouldn't be worried about that. But unless they see that feedback from some other people in a safe environment, then they wouldn't be really think at that way. And also attending in those forums and seeing other people's work has been presented and people accepting them, then it makes them more believing in what they have done is good enough or even above the standard that they are expecting.
Look, I think that those are great suggestions. Certainly using peer or group type settings can be very helpful in breaking down some of those barriers. And I think once students like May can see the benefit of that feedback, once they open up and are receptive to that feedback, they can see the benefit that has for improving their work. They usually become more comfortable sharing their work. So yeah, if you're having trouble doing that as a supervisor, try doing that in a kind of group environment. I've had some success doing that as well. And often students are more receptive to their peers than what they will be to their supervisors initially. So that's a nice strategy. I can see in the chat there's some other suggestions as well that I think are well worth trying. So focus on providing oral feedback in the beginning that's more positive. Yeah, I think sometimes you need to handle some students with kid gloves at the start. Pradeepa says having frequent, probably weekly meetings with her, so she has to present her work. That's actually a note that I made about this case study, Pradeepa. I think setting realistic time-bound goals to prevent her from spending too much time focusing on perfection. So you're saying, oh, I want one page next week. So you're not setting a huge goal that's too hard to achieve. Because often with students like me, what happens is instead of sending you little bits of work that they can get feedback on over a long period of time, they will want to write up the whole paper or the whole chapter, and they won't want to give it to you until it's perfect, right? And so breaking that down for them and say, well, let's just look at one page, or let's look at the introduction, and being very clear that those are time bound and structured can sometimes be helpful. Encourage getting feedback at a broken down work in progress draft stage, bullet points rather than paragraphs. Yeah, so similar strategy, James, just kind of chunking it down into something that's a little bit more manageable, and enticing the student in so they feel comfortable having their work looked at and getting feedback. I think with May, and I touched on this before, a lot of this is around confidence building. So helping her manage her expectations by providing regular positive feedback and emphasizing that setbacks are a normal part of the research process. The research process is really often about critiquing ideas and going backwards and forwards, and refining ideas can help. Encouraging work-life balance. The other issue with May is that there may be some work-life balance issues here. So discussing strategies to ensure she's prioritising self-care. A lot of students like May will come through a PhD just fine in the end, but there is a risk with students like May that they burn out before they get to the end of the PhD. So as a supervisor, this is something that you do need to keep an eye on. It can be a joy to supervise students like May because they work very hard and they're very diligent, but you do need to keep an eye on their well-being. Let's look at Ahmed. Ahmed's quite different. He's relocated from the Middle East to pursue his PhD in Australia. He's got an excellent academic background, similar to May. But for him, the issue here is more around the academic culture in Australia. So he's come from an environment where the education system is very structured and very directional. And he's really struggling with this idea that as supervisors, we might say to him, it's your PhD, off you go figure out what needs to be done. You come back and tell us what you think you should do next, which is often the style that we tend to pursue here. So he's got a strong work ethic, but he feels isolated. He's not sure about how to approach his supervisors or peers because of language barriers, and he's from a culture where there's big power distance, right? So he certainly will have a lot of respect for his supervisors, but that respect can also get in the way of him interacting with his supervisors at an open level. So how would you handle Ahmed? Maybe you've had a student like Ahmed. I'm keen to hear from you. Has anybody had a student like Ahmed?
I have Pierre. He was a MPhil student, but he was from Saudi Arabia, and he had all the attributes outlined in this particular example. And I don't know that I managed him as well as I could have, but he ended up going back to Riyadh, and we used to communicate by Zoom. Extremely respectful, but I think he had a problem with the Australian culture. He wanted to do his PhD. He asked me, um, in the confidence of this forum, I couldn't have thought of anything worse for me. But he ended up enrolling some other institution, and I don't think it was Saudi Arabia, but it wasn't in Australia, and I was not displeased with that outcome. But he was just like this, and the culture here, too laid back, too imprecise. What you said at the opening, 1+2+3+4+5, that's the way to learn, not this freewheeling sort of stuff. I cope with it by embracing his remoteness, and I don't know that I cracked it. But his profile fitted. You replaced that name with his name, and the profile fitted what you've described here.
So very challenging. It sounds like you felt like you didn't have a full answer for how to manage Ahmed Russell.
No, I sympathise with it.
Yeah. Quite challenges. Anybody else had a student like Ahmed? We have quite a lot of students, I must say, that do fit this profile, and they do make it through their studies. How would you handle it, Zoe? You look like
I've
you're coming
had
off mute.
a student who's kind of like a mix of May and Ahmed before, and I find it really helpful if you just like sit down and have kind of like a one-on-one meeting and just explain kind of what's expected, what to call. Like, because sometimes people don't even know what to call you. Often they call you like Dr. Zoe or Dr. West, and it's like, no, no, you can call me Zoe, that's fine. Here's how you can address me in emails. It's totally okay to say hello, Zoe. You don't need to say dear Dr. West every single time. So in my experience, it was just really helpful. I think for the student, it's just like when I sat down and said, like, here's what the expectations are, and like it's a lot more laid back. And I think they were really happy with that once I explained to them, like, what is okay. And they just didn't want to like come off as rude to me, I think. And when I explained to them that, this is not rude in Australia, like they were really happy.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That awareness of where some of those cultural differences are is a good starting point. And I've used similar strategies with my students. I used to teach cross-cultural communications. I happen to know where a lot of these differences are, and they do come down to um, things like the formality of titles and the formality of how you interact with people. It does help to say to students that Australian culture is very relaxed, it's very laid back, that some of the formalities that apply in some other cultures don't necessarily apply in Australian culture. I had one student who would not look me in the eye. And of course, in most Western cultures, particularly in Australian culture, when somebody doesn't look you in the eye, you think that they're being shifty. And it took me a long time, the students from Indonesia, it took me a long time to figure out that there was a status thing going on there, and that in some parts of Indonesia, it's disrespectful to look a higher status person in the eye. And they'd grown up with this cultural conditioning, and so they were finding it very difficult. So it's little things like that that can just make an interaction feel a little bit off, right? And so having a conversation early on about those cultural differences and putting them on the table and talking through them, I find can be very helpful as an icebreaker. Any other thoughts, suggestions, comments? Not seeing anything else in the chat about this one. So what Zoe was talking about there is providing cultural context. I think we can go even further than that. We can also provide some context around Australian academic culture. And that again requires a little bit of awareness of just how our culture is different to other academic cultures around the world. And that can be hard to do for the Australians in the room who don't know anything else. But that it is important just to be aware that our culture in Australia, the academic culture, is quite different to other parts of the world. Even some English-speaking parts of the world. With May, we talked about maybe building a peer network. I think I would do the same with Ahmed, but here I'd encourage him to join peer groups or mentoring programs or cultural societies that can help him adjust. We do have a number of cultural societies and student clubs here at UQ that would seem to align more with Ahmed and his background. They can often be useful in softening that cultural shock that students like Ahmed experience when they first come to a very different culture. And with Ahmed's background, it might be useful if he seems to be struggling with his writing and communicating in academic English, to also have a look at some of the academic writing support that's available. We do have a number of programs in the graduate school through the career development framework to help students with their writing. There are other supports available through student services. And so there are a range of different mechanisms that could be used to support Ahmed if that was one of the issues as well, if language was a barrier for him. My students often ask me, my national students, whether they can record our meetings. As a supervisor, I don't have a problem with that, but I also don't work in a research area that's highly sensitive or where confidentiality is important. So that's something that you might have to take on a case-by-case basis, and might be discipline specific. But that's another thing that you can suggest if students don't ask, because I know my students find that very helpful. A couple of things on the chat. Eleanor says the diagram I showed earlier would start by being quite directive and then hopefully over time get more comfortable. So yeah, maybe that kind of approach works well for students like Ahmed. Judith says continuing regular meetings, ensuring advisory team is the right balance, link them with a peer further along their journey. So we've touched on a lot of those points. Yeah, thanks, Judith. Okay, Emma, slightly different profile here, very creative and intelligent PhD candidate. But she does come from more of a neurodiverse background. Look, we've always had neurodiverse students, but I think we've become a lot more in tune to this in the last 3 or 4 years. Certainly I've noticed in my role here in the graduate school, a lot more conversations are happening around how we can support neurodiverse students. So Emma has a passion for her research topic, but she struggles with time management, maintaining focus during extended periods of work. So Emma's the kind of student that seems to have trouble focusing for 2 or 3 months at a time and nothing appears to be happening. And then the pressure of a deadline generates this big flurry of activity, and suddenly she's trying to produce a lot of stuff in a short period of time. She is very good at brainstorming and problem solving, but she finds it difficult because of her ADHD to structure her research and manage deadlines. So she often feels overwhelmed by large tasks, and she doesn't struggle with perfectionism. She struggles with procrastination. How would you deal with Emma? Has anybody had a student like Emma? Judith?
Pierre, yeah. I often with students really spend a lot of time early to find out what works for them and how in the past they've broken these blocks with previous programs. Like sometimes it's, breaking into small tasks with small time frames, or sometimes it's rather than getting them to write, getting them to verbalize what they're thinking and record it so that they can write things down rather than having to look at a blank page, which sometimes can be daunting if they're struggling with that procrastination. So it's just trying to work out different ways that work for them. Sometimes it's also giving them other tasks which will swing them off what they're worried about and then bring them back to the task that they need, sort of thing. Some tricks I've used before.
Yep, absolutely. That's excellent advice. I think with Emma, especially breaking down large tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks so that the task doesn't seem as daunting, because often that procrastination comes about because Emma's turning molehills into mountains, right? So we've got to keep chunking it down into smaller, more achievable goals. Ask her for regular pieces of smaller work rather than saying, I want to see a draft chapter by the end of this research quarter. That's just too big a task over too long a period of time. You've really got to chunk it down for Emma to set regular deadlines for her and keep her on track, because she needs that structure to be able to progress. I think with Emma also, you might want to think about her work environment, to check whether the environment that she's in is working for her. If she is coming in to a kind of shared PhD space, whether there might not be some sensory issues that could be interfering with her ability to focus. Emma may be the kind of student that is highly social and likes to chat with all the other PhD students in the office and doesn't actually get any work done when she's there, right? And if that's the case, it would be good to understand that, so that we can maybe coach Emma around finding a setting where she might be able to get some more productive work done. In some cases, with students like Emma, we could also have a look at assistive technology. I'm going to talk about student access plans later on in this session, which is a formal kind of mechanism that the university uses often in the coursework space to support students like Emma, but you might not be aware that it is a tool that we can also use for our HDR students. So I'll come back to that, but using some of those mechanisms, or using project management apps or Gantt charts or mind mapping software that's more visual, that can help Emma kind of see the different dimensions of the task or the topic that she's looking at. Might be worth trying in this case. And Thomas, I see your comments there as well, and Robert, recording interviews, then using automatic transcription, turn it into writing, then work together to summarize it. Absolutely. The tools now that combine AI with recording your transcripts and can take a meeting where you've had a conversation with your student and turn it into a set of minutes with action items just blows my mind. Some of my students are using some of those tools now, and really makes tasks like this much easier than what they were before. Okay, so hopefully those 3 case studies just help you reflect on just some different needs. There are other needs I could have touched on, but those profiles are not dissimilar. Some of the students we sometimes see often too late in the process. So we pick up on some of these issues when students are in their 3rd year, often, and they haven't progressed, and then it becomes apparent what the issue is. As a supervisor, if you're on top of these issues and you become aware of them early on and you're checking in regularly with candidates, the journey often goes much more smoothly. Obviously, you wouldn't pair a hands-off supervisor with a student like Emma, because Emma's going to need a lot of structure and is likely to be very hands-on. So I think there's also something to be said for having the right team in place to support the student. And if you feel at any point that you're not the right supervisor for the student, I don't want you to walk away just because the student is a bit difficult, but you do need to think about whether the student has the right team, or whether they might be better served by having a slightly different mix of team members. I don't know how many of you have seen the Universal Design for Learning guidelines. Version 3 of these guidelines have just been released in July, and if you're in the teaching and learning space, you might be very familiar with these. But this is actually a really nice framework to apply to your supervision as well. So I'd encourage you to have a look at this. The UDL website is very nicely done, I must say. It's very interactive. If you scan that QR code on the slide there, you'll be able to go and poke around on the website while I talk, and you can bookmark it and have a look at it. But essentially, UDL is a set of principles for curriculum development that aims to give all individuals opportunities to learn. So it's a very useful framework to use when we're talking about students who have diverse needs. The 3rd version of the framework is built around 3 main principles, each focusing on a different aspect of learning. The first dimension is engagement, and this principle is really about the why of learning. So it focuses on motivating learners, sustaining their interest, and promoting self-regulation. if you're following this this webinar on a big screen, you may be able to read the text there. If you're following on a phone, I apologize. Some of this text is going to be a little bit small to read, but we'll work through this framework in a minute. Engagement. Representation is the second principle and addresses the what of learning. And so it's really about presenting information and content in different ways to accommodate diverse learning styles and abilities. And then the third one's about action and expression. And this is the how of learning. So it provides learners with various ways to interact with the material and demonstrate their knowledge. So what I like about the UDL framework is that it emphasizes learner variability and identity, and it recognises that each learner brings their own background, skills, and needs to the educational experience. And the third version also recognises the impact of systemic or systemic biases on learning, and what they've focused on with this third version is really on how we can create more equitable learning environments. So it's a really interesting framework. Question I've got for you, having just very briefly introduced it, is how you think UDL guidelines might be applied to the HDR supervision space. I'll put that UDL back up because I want you to reflect on that for a minute and give me some thoughts either in the chat or by coming off mute. Let's maybe just talk about engagement, for example. If you scan through that framework, what do you think we might be able to do in our supervision to design multiple means of engagement? Any thoughts? So the first point on engagement is around access and making the content or the topic more accessible to students. And the suggestion there is in more formal curricula that we can optimize choice and autonomy. How might we do that in a supervision setting? How do you guys approach this with your students? Oh, I've stumped people now. All right, well, let me give you some thoughts. I think the first part of that engagement framework is really about getting candidates to align the topic with their own personal interests or career goals. So finding a way to make the content or the project relevant to the candidate, encouraging candidates to connect their research to real-world applications or societal impacts, or to perhaps find some kind of personal meaning in the work they're doing. So this is easier in some disciplines than others. Particularly in the humanities and social science disciplines, we often take the student through a journey in their first year to further refine their topic and to hone in on what the research problem is. I appreciate that that's sometimes not the case in the STEM areas, where a student might come in and the project and the topic is already very tightly defined for them and it's basically given to them, right? So there are some disciplinary differences here, but it is important, I think, to think about how we can make the topic that the student is doing more accessible. And this also speaks to particularly the start of a PhD journey, when you first start working with a new candidate, how you help them navigate the literature and find their way through that literature to open up that literature to them. The support is really around how we sustain effort and persistence, and some of the techniques we've already talked about with some of our case studies previously are relevant here. So breaking long-term research goals into more manageable milestones can make that learning more accessible. Providing regular feedback and encouragement can make that learning more accessible. And unfortunately, I think too many supervisors are of the view that they don't want to see the students' work until that progress review deadline comes up, or they don't want to see the students' work until they're ready to submit a draft thesis for feedback. And I think that's because that's how a lot of us were supervised 20 or 30 years ago. But if we're going to make this learning accessible to a wider range of learners, it makes sense to provide regular feedback more often and in smaller chunks. So that's just something I'll leave you with to think about. I think the quality and timing of feedback is really important. Karen's linked the guidelines in the chat for us as well, which is great. Will says introducing students to their peers and other colleagues to foster their own community of practice and support. I think that's a good suggestion as well, Will. And then the third point is about emotional capacity. So how we help students or coach students to self-regulate is really important as well. So for students like Emma, helping candidates to develop time management and project planning skills, encouraging reflective practice. So I know in some disciplines, students are encouraged to keep a research journal. In some of the sciences, students actually keep lab records and journals as well. So you kind of do that as part of your normal practice, recording what you did. So that the students are able to track their progress, their emotions, and track their journey. That can be a really, really useful exercise.
I was going to say, Pierre, yeah, I was going to say that there's also, I mean, I know there's that very, I guess, sometimes quite intense relationship between one's advisor and the student. But I was also going to suggest that UQ, I mean, I noticed somebody talked about the different graduate school courses and outlines back earlier, the one that can't remember who that was, but I was also going to say that UQ also has a variety of services outside that can support, outside outside of that kind of almost PhD bubble, our HDR bubble. So, and I guess for me, possibly that kind of like directing people to outside of that relationship might be also supportive as well.
Absolutely. At Student Services run a range of things. The various clubs and societies across campus run different activities as well, from mindfulness exercises and meditations and yoga. And this is so many different opportunities for students to connect and become part of the community outside of their direct group of researchers or lab mates. I think that's all important in trying to encourage that engagement across different levels. Representation, this is that second pillar in the purple that you see in the UDL, and here I think we need to think about when we talk about perception, offering research materials in multiple formats. I know sometimes when I focus with my students on stuff, we tend to focus too much on text. So I'll send them off to go and do a reading, or sometimes I'll try and explain things using text, and actually that's not always the best medium to explain something. And so when I've hit a brick wall and I don't seem to be getting a point across to my students, sometimes I need to take a step back and maybe use a diagram or a mind map, or I will see if I can find a good video. And there are fantastic video resources online now on various research methods and techniques and topics. So think outside the box. I think we become overly reliant on the academic literature and the text-based literature. And the main point here is about thinking about different formats in which we can open up information to our students, making digital resources available to candidates with visual or auditory impairments also is going to be important, but that's a much more specialized point. Language and symbols, so clarifying discipline-specific jargon and providing glossaries of key terms can be useful. For some students, when they come into our environment and start a PhD, it can feel a bit like we're talking a different language, and we need to remember that They don't come with the 20 or 30 years of experience that we've got already in that discipline. Providing visual aids, diagrams and concept maps that explain complex research methods or theoretical frameworks, or providing diverse examples and case studies to illustrate those research concepts can be useful. And then the action and expression side of it, this is more about how we get or encourage students to share or express their ideas or thoughts. And again, here I think in academia, we focus too much on text. Yes, the student has to produce a thesis, and that's largely a text-based piece of work, but there are so many other types of media that students could use to express their ideas. And there's a quick plug here for the 3-minute thesis competition. I actually just had the Asia Pacific final just before this session earlier this afternoon, which was won by a student at Griffith University in the creative arts space, which is unusual. Usually it's not humanities and arts students that win these. But a 3-minute thesis competition, of course, is a different format for presenting your work. University of Melbourne created the Visualize Your Thesis format, where students have to communicate their thesis in a 1-minute video. And we run a UQ version of that competition, and the winner goes on to compete in the national finals. So there are those opportunities that are structured competitions, but they do make you think about other ways in which you can get your students to share ideas. And I know some of you working more in lab-based settings do get your students to present to each other in a kind of group setting. And I think that's a really nice thing to do. Are there any other techniques that you use to get your students to present in multiple formats? Eleanor says many past conference presentations, webinars are available for free on YouTube, so that's a great resource. But I'm keen to hear from you. Are there any techniques that you use with your own students to get them to communicate maybe in some different formats?
School of Education runs a postgrad conference every year that's organised by postgrad students, and has it's a very easy way to present. It's low stress, but it's still, you have to submit an abstract. There's feedback. There's all of those kinds of processes that provide, the keynote speaker on Friday night.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's all great practice. And Will's just pointed out that some screen reader programs can be useful for students who are overwhelmed by reading large amounts of text. Thomas has highlighted conference presentations, describing things with diagrams. So I just encourage you to think a little bit out of the box when you're getting students to communicate their ideas to you. I have sometimes with some of my students who have hit a roadblock and have had a bad case of writer's block, the way I've got them to get over that writer's block is to ask them to instead build a PowerPoint slide deck for me and to present their ideas to me in a meeting. And that's just been enough to break through that wall to get them to help build their confidence, for me to be able to then see what they're thinking and to give them feedback so that they then have the confidence to go away to start writing that up. So little techniques like that can be helpful. Okay. So some supervision strategies based on UDL guidelines. This was just a summary slide of some of the stuff that I've talked about already, but there are a couple of new points in this slide as well. So tailoring your supervision to their interests and career goals, we haven't really touched on yet, but we spoke about it earlier in the presentation. I find it helpful early on when I first start supervising students to clarify what their career goals are. I must admit, most of my own students have become academics, but 2 did not become academics. One of them knew right at the start that she didn't want to be an academic. Her goal was to be a consultant, and today she is, in fact, a very, very successful consultant in the social media space. Because we knew that right from the start, we were able to customize her PhD to help her develop the skills that she would need for that career outcome. We knew that she was never interested in publishing academic papers, And so she did a very applied PhD, and a lot of the training and development opportunities that she got along the way and the methods that she used were methods that she would eventually end up using as a consultant, working with businesses. So that can be really important at the start. Flexible supervision meetings, so structured or informal, offering both structured and informal options to meet and discuss. I find my students often behave quite differently in a structured meeting that we've set up for 1 hour supervision session to how they might if we're in a more kind of informal setting. So providing those multiple avenues for interaction. Supporting self-regulation, encouraging goal setting and regular reflection we touched on before. Providing diverse research materials we touched on. Breaking down complex concepts we mentioned several times, so I won't labour that point. And then providing accessible feedback in written, verbal and visual forms. We haven't really explored that as much as we could have, but that's really important. Some of my students want and expect a lot of detailed written feedback, and that really helps them. For others, they just completely flip out if they get a draft from me with lots of annotations and feedback and track changes on them. So you kind of have to test each student a little bit to figure out where they sit on that spectrum. But certainly, in my experience, some students are much more receptive to verbal feedback, and others are much more receptive to written feedback. So identifying early on what kind of feedback works for that student can be really useful. And providing multiple means of action expression, allowing flexible formats for research projects we talked about, encouraging skill development in various areas is important. And Karen mentioned a number of different opportunities across the university. And we've also got the career development framework as well. So there certainly is no shortage of different ways in which students can develop their skills. What I think we sometimes need to do as supervisors is to give permission to students to do that. So some students feel like they feel guilty if they're not working on their PhD all of the time. And sometimes we need to remind them that it's okay to take some time out to focus on the development of some of these skills. So it'll actually make their life easier. And Will has mentioned assistive technologies there, students with special needs as well. It's a couple of key principles then that fall out of that you might want to think about as a supervisor. So I really want you to think about how you make your supervision accessible and inclusive for all. We've talked about regular check-ins, being culturally sensitive, incorporating relevant examples that students can relate to, and adapting timelines and plans where necessary. Discussing expectations is important, and I'll come back to some of the tools that the university provides to help you do that. We'll come back and talk about individual development plans, because that is another tool that we provide our HDR students with at UQ, and setting flexible milestones to reflect different learning spaces. Now, there are some constraints around that. We do have a process of progress reviews at UQ, it used to be called milestones, that are fixed, and those are not very flexible, but they, for most students, only happen every 12 months. So we're talking about what happens in between those 12 months, and there's actually quite a lot of flexibility in how you pace things for different students to meet their needs. Some tools and techniques for tailoring supervision, practical resources. I think as a supervisor, it's useful to think about how you help students set goals. And some supervisors are very hands-off and don't really provide a lot of structure for students, but I've always found it useful as a supervisor early on to sit down with my students and to talk to them about the importance of goal setting, what that looks like, how you do it, because some students have never really had to do that before. Remember, they come from a different education system, a different culture, where they've never been asked to do that. And so sometimes you have to coach them, help them understand what goal setting is, what it looks like, what a good goal is, what a realistic timeline is, how you measure progress, all of those things that we think are pretty basic. Sometimes you need to cover off with students. and then helping them understand that that's a shared conversation, that they're working as part of a team that's there to support them is also important.
I
Time
wondered,
management.
sorry, I was
Yeah,
just going to
Karen,
wonder
go
about
ahead.
it, Pierre. Sorry, I was just wondering about that kind of concept. Would you recommend like them thinking about a project management approach to the process as well? I mean, if you think about the, milestones or the, things that you have to reach and mark down, have you ever kind of recommended them sit down and do some kind of Gantt chart or something? Maybe not a Gantt chart, but that's a bit excessive. Yeah, but so certainly I wondered if that was something that you did.
Oh, absolutely. Certainly that's what I do with my students is we project manage the whole thing, right? So there are some timelines that are fixed. We know when the progress reviews are, we know when the thesis is due. And so we work back from that and we do map it out on a Gantt chart. And every student's Gantt chart doesn't look the same. Some students have to work their way through a very rich literature and may spend more time in that bit of the PhD than others. But ultimately, they all have to end up at the same point, and that is for doing a PhD to submit it around about 3.5 years, or for an MPhil, it's around about 1.5 to 2 years, right? So I think that's very useful to project manage that and to think through what needs to happen to get to those the hard goals where the hard deadlines are. Yeah.
Sorry, I've interrupted.
That's okay. Any other comments, thoughts about practical things that you can do with your students? Communication is really important. There are a number of tools that I know experienced supervisors often use with their students, and it sounds very prescriptive and structured, but actually the structure works, and that is to use agendas and minutes. And I'm not talking about really formal agendas like you might have for an academic board meeting or a formal meeting at the university, but a piece of paper that the student sends you a couple of days before the meeting that says, here are the key points I want to discuss, or here are the key questions I've got for you. I find that incredibly useful as a supervisor because it gives me a heads up about things that I might want to go and read or think about before the student actually comes and sits in front of me. So I feel like I'm less on the spot, having to respond sometimes to students in a meeting, and therefore I can provide them with better answers and better support. So using agendas or some kind of mechanism where you ask students to prompt you before a meeting can be very useful. And at the same time, asking your students after each meeting to capture the key action items or the key things you discussed, or to provide a summary of the meeting. You don't have to call them minutes. They can be some kind of record or a half-page summary, whatever works for you. But I found that very, very useful as a supervisor. In some areas of the university, it's not unusual as a supervisor for you to maybe have 6 or 7 students. And if they're all working on topics in a lab that are closely related, it can get confusing. Trying to keep track of where they're up to, what they're working on, and what support they need at that particular point in time. The minutes are very useful as a supervisor for reflecting back on what we discussed last time, therefore what we need to discuss this time. But I know that students also find them useful. A useful exercise for students is every quarter or so to look back over those minutes and to ask, what have we achieved in the last quarter? And those minutes become a really useful record for students to go, oh, hang on, even though I thought I was moving quite slowly and not achieving much, I actually have achieved quite a bit. And so they're a useful reflective tool. So I found it handy as a supervisor to collect templates. A lot of these templates come from my own students who over time have come up with creative, innovative ways of doing these things. And then I keep them and I use them as examples with future students to streamline supervision meetings, to keep them on task and on point. Marcus says we often reflect on the last week's since the last meeting and then make a plan of goals to be clear by the next meeting, where we then review the progress towards them. The goals for the next time can then also be an agenda for the next meeting. So absolutely, yeah. So that's what I'm talking about there, Marcus. So if you're not doing that in your supervision practice, yeah.
Yeah, that was exactly what you described. Like we would probably meet every fortnight or so, and then yeah, like after the meeting, have the student write up what we talk about. So that also gives us kind of an idea of if everybody's on the same page, because
Yeah, that's an
often you
important
can
point.
because often you can discuss things and what the supervisor wants them to do and what they understand they should be doing can be very different, turns out. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
if that's written down, then we can then, like as a supervisor, can jump in straight away and say like, no, that's not what we meant, and
Yeah.
like avoid them working towards something for 2 weeks or however long that then yeah, like goes in, well, was not
Yeah.
what we had in mind.
Absolutely. That's been my experience as well. Some students, you think you've got your point across as a supervisor or as a team, and the student, you think when the students walked away from that meeting, they understand what they need to do next, and then you get the summary and they've emphasized things that you de-emphasized, or vice versa. So it can be very useful sometimes for very quickly picking up and putting them back on the right track. Yeah, before they spend a lot of time going down the wrong path. Yeah. Okay. Any other points, comments, tips that you've got as supervisors that you think we could add as practical tips for supervisors? All right, well, look, let's move on. There's a couple of institutional tools I just wanted to cover off with you. One is a supervisory expectations questionnaire and induction checklist. So when we moved away from milestones a couple of years ago to progress reviews, we introduced this thing called an early candidate checkpoint. It's not compulsory, highly encouraged that students do it. We have actually done a little bit of analysis in the grad school on students that do the early candidate checkpoint, and we know from that analysis that students who have done their early candidate checkpoint are significantly more likely to do their first progress review correctly and on time. So it does seem to help with the progress review later downstream. Now, I don't know if that's just I don't know if there's a correlation there, right? It may just be that the more conscientious students do their checkpoint and then are also, because they're more conscientious, more successful their progress review. But I thought it's a point worth mentioning. It's that does seem to help students later on. One of the things we ask students to do in that early candidate checkpoint is to have a conversation with their supervisors about expectations. There are lots of ways to have that conversation, but we do provide a tool that you can use with your students called the Supervisory Expectations Questionnaire. If you Google UQ HDR Supervisory Expectations Questionnaire, you should be able to find it on our website. I should highlight that the graduate school does have an intranet site for supervisors. It is really the UQ HDR Supervisor Manual, for want of a better word, but we haven't called it that. So it's an intranet on the graduate school website where you can access information about all different stages of the journey. So you'll also find the expectations questionnaire there, and it's a kind of semantic scale type questionnaire that you fill out. So it has things on it like who's responsible for organising supervision meetings, the supervisor or the student, and on it goes. It's got a number of different items, and it's a really useful tool to complete as a supervisor, and then to have your student to complete it. And what you do is you then take your two responses and you basically compare them, and you talk about points where the expectations are not the same in a meeting. I do that with every student that I commence, usually in the first month or two. Because what you find through that exercise sometimes is that some students thought it was my job to organise the meetings, not their job, right? My expectation is that they organise the meetings. And you can imagine what happens if we both think someone else is responsible for organising the meetings. The meetings don't get organised. I find out through that process sometimes that some students expect really detailed feedback on every piece of work they give me, and that they expect that they're going to give me a piece of work every 2 weeks to comment on, right? And that might be fine if that's your supervision style. but I don't have the capacity to provide quite that much feedback. And so there's a conversation then about how much feedback they can expect from me and how often they can expect it. That often leads to a conversation about, well, if you send me a draft as your supervisor, how quickly do you expect me to be able to look at it so that I can provide comments? The student says, oh, maybe a week. And I'll go, whoa, hang on. There are some parts of the year where I might not be able to turn around feedback on a whole chapter in a week. And so that conversation is useful because it helps students understand expectations around how much time to allow for supervisors to comment on their work, to provide meaningful feedback, and so on. You get the idea, right? So it is a very useful tool. Karen's managed to track it down, which is quite a feat, Karen. It's not easy to find stuff sometimes on our website, and so it's a useful questionnaire to have a look at. The induction checklist is another tool that comes with that. That is a slightly different tool. It just has a checklist of the types of things that you might go through with a student early on in candidature. It's particularly important in more of the STEM-based areas where students are going into labs or workshops or workplace settings where there are also health and safety and workplace expectations. But it has a number of things on it that you could run through with your candidate just to make sure that they're settling in and well supported right from the start. A lot of those things are not things you have to do, but they are just things that you can refer your student to make sure that they're set up. Individual development plans I'll come back to and talk about in a minute, and then student access plans. But I've talked about setting expectations. Very useful for talking about the frequency and format of meetings. The preferred feedback methods and timelines for feedback, the communication styles and availability, the stuff we've been talking about before, and expectations for progress milestones and deadlines. Individual development plans. I'll come back to your question, Thomas. I can see that there, but we'll talk about SAPs in a minute. So individual development plans are embedded into progress reviews now. We ask students at each progress review to do an individual development plan. The reason for that is the focus has shifted from just producing a thesis at the end to producing a well-qualified candidate. And so the conversation is much more about the person as a whole rather than just the piece of work or the thesis that they produce. And so when students go through a progress review, the progress review panel is meant to look at their written work, but also to consider their development as an individual. And the idea of an individual development plan is to recognise that not every student is the same, that different students have different goals. And if students work through this individual development plan, they go through a process of reflecting on what their goals are, assessing where their gaps might be in terms of skills development or skills that they might need to develop, prioritizing those, planning for their development, and then implementing those plans. There are a range of different ways in which students can develop their skills during their HDR candidature. We've mentioned the Career Development Framework before, which has 90-odd different courses in it, structured around professional, transferable, and research skills that students can dip in and out of. There are other opportunities provided by student services and by the library for students to develop their skills in a whole range of different areas. And of course, there are external opportunities. So a lot of students will also develop their skills by going to discipline-based conferences and workshops and PhD sessions run by your various different disciplines. All we want students to do is to have a little bit of a plan for how they do that, so they're not stumbling through their candidature and serendipitously coming across some of these opportunities. That there's some kind of plan and some thoughts gone into what their goals are and what opportunities they might want to prioritise. So the key features are the students do a self-assessment, they reflect on their strengths and areas for improvement, they formulate a plan that aligns with their career aspirations, they regularly update the individual development plan. By regularly, we mean sort of roughly once a year. And the idea is not that you start from scratch every year, but that you take the one that you did the previous year and you build upon it. So it's much more like the academic appraisal process that we have for staff at UQ, where you're meant to look at your goals and then think about what your development needs are. The idea is that they do this together with you as the supervisor, because this is where your ability to coach and mentor your students becomes really important. We do provide a template to help students do that, to work their way through that. And we also provide a development needs analysis, which is optional. It's not compulsory because it's quite a detailed, complex instrument to use, but it is a tool that's there for people to think about where their skills, the sorts of skills that they might need to develop. Student access plan. So Thomas has said, what does an SAP do for a HDR student? Is it pragmatic, not needing medical certificates for sick leave, or is it more about formalising the state of affairs? So let's talk about student access plans. I think the one thing to point out here is that these are not managed by the graduate school. They're managed by student services. So to enact a student access plan, students book an appointment with a student advisor through UQ's student services to develop their SAP, right? And they're designed to support students with disabilities, medical conditions, or significant responsibilities. So students who have got caring responsibilities for elderly parents or children, or a partner that might be unwell, students who have a disability, students who have a medical condition, neurodiverse students. There's really a very broad range of categories that student access plans can apply to. Some of you that are teaching will be aware of student access plans because they're used in the course workspace, and in fact that's what they were initially designed for. And so you may have received them as course coordinators to approve, to make reasonable adjustments for students and coursework. In the HDR space, that's a little bit different because obviously students are not involved in structured coursework. The kinds of reasonable adjustments we can make for students look a little bit different to the way that they look for a coursework student. So the things that we can't adjust are the progress reviews and the submission dates. Those are immovable because often they're linked to a student's scholarship. So the key difference between a HDR student and a coursework student is that coursework students pay us for their education, but HDR students are getting paid by us. Usually we're paying their scholarship, right? And because of that environment, there are constraints around how long the federal government allows us to keep paying students for before we pull the plug on them and say, hey, you haven't finished your PhD in a timely way. So I wanted to be clear about that. There are some things that we can't move. Those are hard deadlines. But within those constraints, there are a lot of other things that we can do for students with a student access plan. And student services generally are aware of these things. So they will sit down with a HDR student when they're developing the SAP to consider what their disability or special need is, and then to work with them to identify the sorts of adjustments that might be made. So we've had students who have been sight impaired, or we've had neurodiverse students who have had sensory issues, and we've been able to make accommodations in their lab or their workplace setting or their office setting to be able to accommodate their needs. Other examples are things like ergonomic workstations or specialized equipment or assistive technology to improve accessibility in workspaces. We had some students working in lab settings who couldn't stand up for long periods of time, and so we had to make adjustments to the spaces so that they were still compliant from a workplace health and safety perspective, but allowed the student to sit down every now and then so they can continue to work. I talked about the recording of meetings before. That's an accommodation that could be made. You don't actually need an SAP to do that, but those are sometimes things that we put into SAPs. Flexible meeting formats or flexible ways of providing feedback to accommodate a student's communication preferences. Structured supervision plans of regular check-ins to track progress. Sometimes on those SAPs, we work with the advisory team, or student services work with the advisory team, just to put in place a little bit more structure around when and how the student engages with their supervisors. Very common for us is when we get to those progress reviews and oral exams, is we have students who suffer from anxiety. That's actually very common. And there are a number of adjustments we can make to the way that progress review meeting takes place, or the way that their oral examination takes place, to reduce the level of anxiety that the student might face. So we could, for example, accommodate a different format. So rather than the student having to defend their work live in front of examiners or in front of a progress review panel, we could request that those progress review readers or examiners send their questions in advance. We could also put in place an adjustment where the student responds in writing rather than having to respond in person. So I think you can see there's a range of different accommodations we can make. I don't want to go into all of the different permutations of that, but I just want to let you know that there is that flexibility. If you are supervising a student, you are aware that they might have issues with anxiety, or they might be neurodiverse, or there might be some other medical conditions impacting on their ability to think about a student access plan, to encourage them to talk to a student advisor, to get a plan in place so that we might be able to do some of these things with them. The last one there is additional allowances for leave or interruption. The university is quite constrained when it comes to interruptions for HDR students. Generally, the students can request interruptions of up to 12 months over a 3.5-year candidature, but the Dean does have the ability to approve longer periods of interruption on compassionate grounds, and typically we would do this for students who have who are battling a serious illness like cancer, for example, or who are caring for a child or a parent who's going through a terminal illness. So those are extreme examples, but in a population of 4,500 PhD students, we certainly have those every year. And if your student is going through something like that, it's important to understand that they're not on their own, that there are structural supports that they can seek out to support them. Thomas, have I answered your question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of a student I have in particular who has a medical condition, which means he has to take, the whole week off every now and again. And I'm sort of wondering, would it be beneficial for him to have an SAP in place so that he doesn't have to go to the doctor to get a medical certificate all the time? Or would it, which I think is, similar for the analogy I'm thinking of is extension requests for assessment in the coursework space. And I mean, yeah, I'm just wondering if there's that sort of practical benefit that comes with having an SAP in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't, on the top of my on my feet, off the top of my head, I can't think about what the solution is for him right now, but I think it'd be well worth him talking to a student services advisor. That they're the experts in this space, and I'm sure they'll be able to sit down with him and work through whether there are some allowances or adjustments that could be made for him.
Okay. Yeah, I'll advise him to look at it. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, the reason I'm putting the slide in is a lot of people don't realise that we can do SAPs for HDR students as well, and that was really the main point. And we can do them for all sorts of reasons. They used to be student access disability plans, as some of you would know, and now they're just student access plans because they're not just for students with disabilities. There are a whole range of circumstances where you might look at that, but certainly, Thomas, the idea that a student have to get a medical certificate every time they're away for a week, I think we should be able to overcome by putting an SAP in place, at least alleviate that burden.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions about some of those support mechanisms? Okay, well, I thought we might finish early, but any final questions before we sign off? It's past 5, so I'm keen. I know some of you are probably keen to go. I know a few people had children returning from school and so on and have had to leave early, so I don't want to keep you longer than what we need to. But I hope that you've got something out of this session to help you support your students better and to help you think about how you can tailor your supervision services for or supervision for for different needs and different students.
I've just got a question before everybody goes. Was this? I mean, Pierre said at the beginning, this is the first time we've kind of thought about running something like this in Teaching and Learning Week, and I was just wondering how effective it was for you. Is this a good place to put something like this?
Yeah, it's a good question, Karen. We'd be keen to hear from you. If you don't feel comfortable saying something now, I'm sure Italy would love to receive your feedback because it is a bit of an experiment for us, and we're keen to hear whether we should do something similar next year. Might be on a different topic, but at least have something on HDRs as part of Teaching and Learning Week.
Yeah, it's just a thumbs up and we will be sending out an evaluation form at the end of the week. So if you have any thoughts on what you might like that would be effective and useful, then please. We actually have a Ready to Teach week. Is there worth having a Ready to Advise week, or not a week? That might be a bit much, but is it worth having these kind of sessions? And I do know that you do have the UQ Graduate School runs sessions for people, don't they, Pierre?
We do. We have our Contemporary Expectations workshop, which is mandatory for people who want to be principal advisors. But if you're not a principal advisor, you're more than welcome to join that. We run, I think, 3 or 4 of those a year. 3, I think. Will's hopefully still online. The next one's on the 26th of February. They are long sessions. They go for 4 hours, but the feedback we get on them is very positive. Yeah.
Okay.
Will says 3 a year at the moment. The next one's the 26th of February. You sign up for those through Workday. We also have the Committee of Practice. So this Committee of Practice, we try to run at least 2 things a year. The last one was more focused on expectations. I just covered that very briefly this time, but we did a whole session on expectations earlier in the year, and it was face-to-face. So usually what we'll try and do with Committee of Practice is do 1 face-to-face session and 1 online session. And this was the idea for the online session this time.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for popping that in the chat too, everyone. That's great.
Thanks, everyone. We're getting some thumbs up and some good feedback there. So it sounds like it was worth doing. I hope you all got a lot out of it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The recording will be available too.
Thanks. If you could share that with me, Karen, that would be good, because I've had a few people ask.
Yeah. We can put it through ChatGPT and get that. Because I've got the transcription as well, so that'll be nice.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll save the chat as well for you. For me, I'll save the chat, and I will. You'll get a copy of that as well. So that's good.
Yeah.
And apologies. It would have been fun to go into the breakout rooms, but we had unintended consequences.
That was okay, I think, because we had a small group. It would have been challenging, I think, if everybody that we just did turned up.
Yes, well, there were 70 registrations. It was like obviously, But anyway, good to be here. Interesting, and I'll see you on the other side.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.